This is a story about two boys and their service to each other. It's also the story of our Western heritage, about the Indians and pioneers that settled this land. And it's a story about growing up and being true to the right. This is the story that was told to me by Ross Rudd of Belmont Ward, Box Elder County, Utah, and told to him by Moroni Timbimbu, chief of the Shoshone at Washakie. Ross was Moroni's home teacher, and in the latter days of the old Indian's life, he actually offered to give Ross the full eagle feather war bonnet of Chief Washakie himself. Ross refused this treasure, but he accepted this treasure, this story, which he shared with me, and which now I share with you. When the Mormons first came into this land, which they called Deseret, it was the dream of their leader, Brigham Young, to establish colonies throughout all the Rockies, and to build here in the tops of these mountains Zion. He sent settlers in all directions, families to found communities. One of the such families was the Salmon family, which he sent far to the north, into the land which would become the Idaho territory. To Old Man Salmon, he gave documents deeding him land and the right to divide it among the people that would come. He also gave to him a large quantity of gold to be the foundation of wealth for the new community. Brother Salmon gathered together all his possessions, his family, his children, and headed north. At that time, he had a son named John. John was 14, the same age as many of you. He was strong and bright and true. They also had a horse, a beautiful black stallion, the finest horse in all the country. And with these treasures, they moved out into a land which they thought was empty. But in those days, the land between the Great Salt Lake and the Yellowstone was the land of the Shoshone people, and it was anything but empty. Among the Indians, there was another boy of 14. He was the prince of his people, well favored by his father the chief, who gave to him horses and tack, and gave to him beautiful clothes to wear. His name was Pocatello. Yes, that city in the Big Bend of the Snake bears his name today. But in those days of his youth, Pocatello was far more interested in gaining friends and more important in gaining status among them. Thus it was that he fell in with a group of older boys, a group of boys who were in rebellion against their parents and against the teachings of the elders. In fact, they ran renegade, and Pocatello with them. And so it was, as the Salmon family moved north, they came under the gaze of this group of renegades, this gang of teenage Shoshone toughs. They were interested in that beautiful horse. They coveted that stallion, and they began to follow the Salmons at a distance because they were afraid of their guns, but they were there constantly. Now, the Salmons knew little of Indians, and they were terrified. But that was not the greatest of their problems. To us, the journey from Salt Lake or Ogden to the Yellowstone is hours of beautiful drive. But in those days, it was many weeks of suffering. And as they approached the far end of the Wasatch Mountains, just west of Logan, Utah, one of their daughters died. With great sorrow, they prepared her grave. And Salmon was so upset by the constant Indians and by the loss of his child, he feared for the treasures given him by the prophet. And so he buried the documents and the gold in his daughter's grave and piled the stones above it, confident that the Indians would not disturb it there. And then he headed north. But the boys followed because the treasure they wanted was going that way. Days later, the Salmons met at the Big Bend of the Snake, a large company of pioneers following the Oregon Trail towards Oregon. There were many guns and many men, and these knew a lot about Indians. They told them that they had nothing to fear from the Shoshone, that they were an honest people, and that they would have no interest in their gold or their documents. Now surrounded by so many men and in the protection of so many guns, Brother Salmon began to regret his decision to leave behind the prophet's treasures, and so he determined to send back his son John to retrieve the gold and documents from his sister's grave. Sister Salmon prepared a special saddle blanket with secret compartments to secret the gold and the documents, and putting John upon that great black stallion, they sent him back to his sister's grave. The Indian boys were aware of him. They had drawn off when there were so many white men and so many guns, but now as they saw their treasure fleeing south, they gave hot pursuit. But their ponies were no match for that great black stallion, and he passed through them on down the country to his sister's grave. With greatest reverence he opened it, removed her tiny body, took out the documents and the gold, replaced her body, built up the mound of stones, filled his saddle blanket, and turned for the north. But the renegades were not to be outdone twice. They hid themselves in the heavily wooded stream that runs through the town of Beaver Dam, Utah, even today. And there, as John slipped down off his horse to guide it through the steep banked creek bed, up jumped the Indian boys and grabbed him. The leader of the gang wanted to know what he was up to. They could not speak in words, but he tried to force John to reveal his secret. But though they beat him savagely, he would not disclose his errand. Finally, the biggest of the bullies took a razor-sharp arrow point, and forcing John's mouth open, he cut his tongue down the middle, from the back of the throat to the tip. And then they stripped him naked and tied him to a great cottonwood stump, and taking the horse, they rode off and left him there to die. They had bound him with wet rawhide thongs, knowing as they dried they would grow even tighter and pull his bonds in that direction, and that they would cut into his flesh. Pocatello felt terrible. He knew what they had done was wrong, that it was against the wisdom of his father, against the teaching of his loving mother, against the example of the elders who held him in honor. But what could he do? He was the youngest of the boys. He had to maintain their approval. That night he laid rolled in his robes by the fire's edge and thought of the white boy. When at last he dozed fitfully, he was suddenly awakened. A voice seemed to speak into his mind. "Pocatello, you must save the white boy." But he dare not. He dare not lose the support of his friends. Then again the voice came clearly to him. "Pocatello," into his heart it spoke, "you must save the white boy." Again he ignored it, and then a third time the voice came, clear as my voice to yours, into his ears. It said, "Pocatello, you must save the white boy." And Pocatello knew it was the voice of the Great Spirit. Having heard the voice of God 3 times, he gathered his gear quietly. He took all the things of John's that he could lay hands on, the blanket, his saddle, and the great white horse, and silently slipped off into the night. His heart led him back to the great cottonwood stump. There he cut the rawhide bands. He bound the wounds of the boy and covered him in his own robes. He built a fire to keep him warm, and with a tea of sagebrush, he bathed the wound on his tongue. And the next morning, he mounted him on that great black horse and took him back to his family. Now the story could end here and end well, but it does not. Years went over, and our nation was torn by the great Civil War. The government sent an army to Utah to keep an eye on the Mormons. It didn't take the commander of that army, Colonel Connor, no relation, long to figure out that the Mormons didn't need tending, so he thought he could gain some glory by fighting Indians. The tales of the atrocities he wrought upon the Shoshone people are best told elsewhere. But the day came when Colonel Connor determined that he was going to destroy all the Indians. With an army of 5,000 men and 5 cannons, he moved north into the new Idaho territory, determined to win his greatest glory. But the Shoshone were not to be surprised. Their great war chief had gathered together 4,000 warriors, and they lay in wait. And who was the great leader of the Shoshone? Who was the war chief that made preparation? It was our friend Pocatello. I know all of you have heard of the Battle of Little Bighorn, but had that great massacre occurred, believe me, Custer's last stand would have been reduced to a footnote in history. But as it was, at the last moment, word came from the governor of Idaho that he wanted to arbitrate the conflict. He ordered Connor, who was his subordinate, to accompany him to the village of the chief. And believe me, as he rode through that great encampment, Connor realized the folly of his attack. There they came to the great lodge of the chief and came in and sat across the fire from him in the circle of the tepee. And Chief Pocatello passed across the fire the peace pipe, and Governor Salmon took it. And as he opened his mouth, the chief's bright eyes saw the terrible scar that ran from the back of the tongue to the tip, and the two men recognized each other and were reconciled. And Governor Salmon told Connor to get his army out of Idaho. And then, to secure the peace, he gave to the Shoshone all that beautiful land, the finest farmland, the finest potato land in the world, to be theirs forever. And there they established Fort Hall Reservation to protect them from the growing power of the white man. And you see, Pocatello saved his people, not by axe in battle, though he was a great warrior, but because when he was a boy, he was true to himself and to the things that he knew to be right, despite the influence and opinion of others. And he hearkened to the words of the Great Spirit as it spoke to his heart.